Sometimes my mind likes to go down a little rabbit hole on a subject, or you might call it a thought journey, where I consider possibilities about a mystery and come up with something, but what I come up with isn't necessarily an answer to the question that I'm sure is true. It might be true, but I'm not fully convinced of it myself. What I'm talking about today is an example of that. The question I'm looking at today is, why is it that aliens seem to prefer visiting rural or sparsely populated areas and seemingly trying to avoid being seen as much as possible? Think of stories like the Betty and Barney Hill abduction, which was in a rural area of New Hampshire, or the Travis Walton story in the woods of Arizona. There are many other stories like these, and in some cases people claim to be abducted right out of their beds at night. And some of the major UFO sighting events occur in sparsely populated areas, like the Roswell incident in New Mexico, or the Rendlesham Forest incident in the UK, which occurred, as the name suggests, in a forest. Some UFO skeptics would say, if these aliens are from another planet, why don't they just show themselves to everyone? Well, one possibility is I think they might be afraid of us, but that possibility isn't the one I'm talking about here. Seems clear to me they want to avoid being seen as much as possible. If they wanted to be seen by many, I would assume they could do that. But why is it they want to avoid being seen? Well, in this age of sci-fi, something that comes to mind to me is time travel. Think about the common sci-fi story tropes. In some stories, time travelers want to change some specific event that happened in the past. But in others, the time travelers are trying to avoid changing events because they don't know how even the smallest change might ripple through time, like the butterfly effect. This latter story trope is what I'm thinking about here. Now, the next part of this rabbit hole isn't where I'm at today in this thought journey, but just a place along the way. I thought maybe the beings or people in the UFOs aren't from other planets, but are from our future. Because if they are from the future and didn't want to risk changing any significant events in their own past, they'd want to avoid being seen as much as possible and interact with as few people as possible to mitigate the risk of altering the timeline they know. So what's the best way to avoid altering the timeline? Try to stick to rural areas where there are few people. You want to take it a step further? Put the people you abduct to sleep so they don't remember it, or hypnotize them in some way to make them forget. You want to take it one step even further? Abduct them from their beds in the middle of the night, keep them asleep, then put them back in their beds before morning. Doing it that way limits the risk of altering the timeline significantly because you aren't seen and aren't interacting with anyone in a way that would change how an event happened. They might be a little more tired at work the next day, but that's about it, unless they remember part of the abduction event. Then it might alter things a little more if they decide to write a book about it or tell the story on TV or something. But I guess that's a risk the abductors have to take. But if you're a time traveler trying to avoid changing past events, this is the route you'd want to go. You wouldn't want to go land on the White House lawn if you know that never happened, because that would probably change the timeline significantly, and then you also run into time travel paradoxes. Like if you go to the past and change an event, but then you don't exist in the future anymore, then how could you have ever gone back to the past in the first place? Or if you want to change an event you didn't like the outcome of to an outcome you do like, then what motivation would you have ever had to go back in time in the first place once you've changed it? You know, that kind of stuff. The thing is, this explanation just didn't work for me. The time travel paradoxes alone are a problem for me. But more than that, I just don't think people or objects can physically travel backwards in time. I just don't think it works that way. It's sci-fi to me. I know various scientists and physicists have considered time travel in a theoretical sense before, but I'm just not convinced by any of it. So if it's not time travelers, then what? Well, the next phase of this thought journey took me to the idea that maybe they aren't time travelers, but maybe they can see through time. See, I have this idea that a fourth-dimensional being can see through time. So to explain that, think of us. We are three-dimensional beings. We can see and hear our present surroundings. Well, I think a fourth-dimensional being may be able to not only see their present surroundings, but past and future events too. Think of how Doctor Strange saw millions of different potential futures in Avengers Infinity War. So kind of like that. Another way I could illustrate it in a more three-dimensional setting we are familiar with would be concrete. If you see a slab of concrete, you know that it was poured and hardened like a stone in the past. Today's concrete is still wet and being poured, but you know in your mind what it will ultimately look like based on the mold it's poured into. Although if you stick your hand in it while it's still wet, then you know it won't look like you originally envisioned it anymore, and instead you now see it in your mind with your handprint in it. I think that's kind of how time as we know it works. The past is set in stone, while the future can still be molded. Now, we know from experience how concrete works. We've seen the process before, and we know how it ends. But I think for a fourth dimensional being, if they exist, I'm not trying to prove they exist here with hard evidence or mathematical equations. I'm just thinking out loud here. But if fourth dimensional beings exist, I don't think they would necessarily need to have experienced something before to see how it started and how it will look later. I think they can just shift their field of view the way we can turn our heads and look at something from a different angle. So imagine going to look at the pyramids of Giza and being able to see them as they are now, but also being able to shift your field of view another way and see the pyramids being built. Then shift your field of view in the other direction and see how the pyramids look 5,000 years from now. And then they could also see how things happening now could change how they see the pyramids look in the future. That doesn't necessarily mean they can see all possible futures or as far into the future as they like. They may have their limitations, just like how we can only see and hear our present surroundings up to a certain distance. Perhaps these fourth dimensional beings can only see a certain distance into the future or past. And again, these are just my thoughts. I can't prove these beings exist or if that's how they see things. That's just how I would imagine they see things if they do exist. But anyways, with that said, what if these beings in the UFOs aren't time travelers like we've seen in sci-fi stories, but fourth dimensional beings who can see into the future and they can see how their interference would change the future? So to avoid interfering with how the future is supposed to play out, they do their best to avoid making any changes to that by limiting who they interact with. But what do you think? Like I said in the beginning, this was more of a thought journey for me. I'm not convinced I'm right about this. I just think it's a possibility. And even still, even if I'm right, that doesn't necessarily mean it explains every UFO sighting ever. Most UFO sightings can be explained by more common things like misidentified aircraft or bizarre weather phenomena anyway. But for those sightings not so easily explained, what is the motivation for trying to avoid being seen? Are they scared of us? Or they don't think we can handle seeing them? Or are they time travelers? Or can they just see the future and are trying not to change it? Those are my thoughts on that. Thanks for listening.